Captain Rebecca Martinez, had been having coffee in her office when her desk sergeant called to tell her about the situation developing in the main area. She was a 20-year veteran of the force who had worked her way up through the ranks, earning respect through competence and fairness. When she heard that a Navy SEAL commander was addressing two of her officers about their treatment of his son, she knew she needed to handle this situation personally. She approached the group, just as Commander Thompson was explaining the impact of yesterday's events on his family. Captain Martinez had worked with military personnel before and recognized the controlled fury of a professional soldier who was choosing his words carefully. "Commander Thompson," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Captain Martinez. Could we continue this conversation in my office?" David shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. This was someone who understood command presence. "Thank you, Captain." As they walked toward her office, Captain Martinez turned to Officers Chen and Walsh. "You two will wait in conference room B. Don't leave the building." Once they were seated in her office, Captain Martinez closed the door and faced Commander Thompson directly. "Tell me what happened." David recounted the events of the previous day, this time including his son's emotional state and the lasting impact of the encounter. He spoke with the precision of someone accustomed to giving mission briefings, laying out facts without unnecessary emotion. "I've already reviewed the incident report your officers filed," Captain Martinez said when he finished. "It mentions suspicious behavior and failure to cooperate, neither of which matches what you've just described." David wasn't surprised. They falsified their report? That's what I'm going to find out. Captain Martinez leaned back in her chair. "Commander, I want you to know that this is not how we train our officers to interact with the community. What happened to your son was wrong, and it reflects poorly on this entire department." David studied her face, looking for signs that this was just damage control. What he saw was genuine concern and professional embarrassment. "What are you prepared to do about it?" he asked. "First, I'm going to have a very serious conversation with both officers about their conduct and their report. Second, I'm going to review their recent activities to see if this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern. Third, I want to arrange for both of them to undergo additional training on community relations and bias awareness." David nodded. "And if they refuse the training, or if you find a pattern of similar behavior?" "Then they'll find themselves looking for new careers," Captain Martinez said firmly. "I won't have officers on my force who abuse their authority or target children." Over the next hour, Captain Martinez interviewed Officers Chen and Walsh separately. When confronted with the discrepancies between their report and Commander Thompson's account, both men initially tried to justify their actions. But under persistent questioning from someone who clearly knew how to extract the truth, their stories began to fall apart. Officer Walsh, the newer officer, cracked first. He admitted that they had no specific reports of suspicious activity at the store that day. The call they had received was about vandalism 3 blocks away, and they had decided to stop at the store for coffee on their way to investigate. Officer Chun's story unraveled next. Under pressure, he admitted that he had profiled Marcus based on his appearance and location. Assuming that a young black boy in that area after school hours must be up to something illegal. Captain Martinez felt sick as she documented their admissions. These were exactly the kinds of attitudes and behaviors that destroyed community trust in law enforcement and put innocent people at risk. Meanwhile, Commander Thompson waited in the captain's office, using the time to make additional phone calls. He contacted a local civil rights organization that his lawyer had recommended, not because he wanted to file a lawsuit, but because he wanted to ensure that other families wouldn't have to go through what his family was experiencing. When Captain Martinez returned to her office, she looked exhausted. "They've admitted to racial profiling," she said without preamble. "Their report was fabricated to justify their actions after the fact." David felt a mixture of vindication and disappointment. He had hoped to be wrong about what had motivated the officer's behavior. "What happens now?" he asked. "Officer Walsh will be suspended without pay for 2 weeks and required to complete sensitivity training before he can return to duty. If he has any similar incidents in the future, he'll be terminated." David raised an eyebrow. And Officer Chun? Officer Chun has a history of complaints, and this incident shows he hasn't learned from previous warnings. I'm recommending his termination to the police commission. Captain Martinez paused, then continued. I also want to invite you and your family to participate in our community advisory board. We're trying to rebuild trust with communities that have been poorly served by law enforcement, and your perspective would be valuable. David considered the offer. I'll discuss it with my wife and son. Marcus needs to have a voice in decisions that affect him. That evening, the Thompson family sat around their dinner table having the most important conversation of Marcus's young life. David explained everything that had happened at the police station, including the officers' admissions and the consequences they would face. Does this mean it won't happen again? Marcus asked. David and Sarah exchanged glances. They both wanted to protect their son's optimism, but they also needed to prepare him for the realities of the world he was growing up in. It means those particular officers have learned there are consequences for their actions, David said carefully. But there might be other situations in the future where you need to know how to protect yourself. Over the following weeks, Commander Thompson worked with his son to develop strategies for dealing with law enforcement encounters. They practiced staying calm, keeping hands visible, speaking respectfully, and knowing when to comply and when to assert rights. It was education no 12-year-old should need. But David was determined that his son would be prepared. Marcus also began attending community meetings with his parents, where he heard stories from other families who had experienced similar incidents. He learned that his experience, while traumatic, was not unique. More importantly, he learned that there were people working to make things better. 3 months after the incident, Officer Chun was officially terminated from the police force. Officer Walsh completed his training and returned to duty, but he was placed on probation and assigned to work with community outreach programs. Captain Martinez used the incident as a case study and training sessions for all department personnel. The convenience store where the original incident occurred became an unofficial community gathering place. The owner, who had witnessed Marcus's treatment, organized monthly meetings between local residents and police officers to build better relationships and prevent similar incidents. Marcus slowly regained his confidence, though he never forgot the lesson he had learned that day. His grades remained excellent and he continued playing basketball, but he also became an advocate for other young people who faced discrimination. Commander Thompson was eventually elected to the community advisory board that Captain Martinez had mentioned. He used his military background and leadership skills to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community they served. During his first speech to the board, David spoke about the incident involving his son. My family was fortunate, he said. We had resources, education, and connections that many families don't have. We were able to seek justice and get results. But justice shouldn't depend on your job title or your ability to command a room. Every child deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who their parents are or what neighborhood they live in. The speech was recorded and shared widely on social media, sparking conversations about racial profiling and police accountability in communities across the country. 1 year after the incident, Marcus was invited to speak at his school's career day. Instead of talking about wanting to be an engineer, he spoke about wanting to be a civil rights lawyer. He told his classmates about his experience and about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. My dad taught me that serving your country isn't just about wearing a uniform, Marcus said. It's about making sure that the freedoms he fought for are available to everyone, not just some people. In the audience, Sarah Thompson wiped away tears as she listened to her son speak, with a maturity and wisdom that no child should have to develop so young. But she was also proud of the young man he was becoming and the changes he was helping to create. Commander Thompson, watching from the back of the room, felt a complex mixture of emotions. He was proud of his son's courage and eloquence, but he also felt the weight of knowing that Marcus had been forced to grow up too quickly because of other people's prejudices. After the presentation, several parents approached the Thompson family to share their own stories and to thank them for speaking out. It became clear that Marcus's experience had opened up conversations that many families had been afraid to have. The incident that began with two officers making assumptions about a 12-year-old boy buying water had grown into something much larger. It had X. Sarah Thompson knew something was seriously wrong the moment she saw her son's face. Marcus had always been an expressive child, wearing his emotions openly. But the look in his eyes as he approached the car was something she had never seen before. It was a mixture of hurt, confusion, and something that looked disturbingly like fear. "Get in, sweetheart," she said gently. Studying his face as he climbed into the passenger seat, the drive home started in silence. Sarah had learned over the years that Marcus would talk when he was ready, but she could feel the weight of whatever had happened pressing down on both of them. When they stopped at a red light, she reached over and squeezed his hand. "Take your time," she said. "But I need to know what happened." Marcus took a shaky breath and began to tell his mother about the encounter with the police officers. With each detail, Sarah felt her heart sink further. She was a military spouse, married to a man who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting others. She had always believed in the system, in the idea that good people doing good work would be treated with respect and dignity. Hearing about her son's experience challenged everything she thought she knew about the world they lived in. "Did you do anything to make them suspicious?" she asked, immediately regretting the question when she saw Marcus flinch. "No, Mom, I just bought water and was waiting for my bus. I don't understand why they stopped me." Sarah pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine. She sat in the car for a moment, processing what her son had told her. She knew exactly why the officers had stopped Marcus, but explaining racial profiling to a 12-year-old felt like robbing him of his innocence. "Your father needs to hear about this," she said finally. "Is he going to be angry?" Marcus asked, his voice small. "Not at you, honey. Never at you." Commander David Thompson was in his home office, reviewing mission reports, when his wife knocked on the door. He looked up to see Sarah's serious expression and immediately closed his laptop. "We need to talk," she said. "Marcus had an incident today." David listened in silence as his wife recounted their son's experience. With each detail, his jaw tightened a little more. By the time Sarah finished speaking, his hands were clenched into fists on his desk. "Where is he now?" David asked, his voice carefully controlled. "In his room." "He's scared, David. He doesn't understand what happened or why." David stood up, his tall frame filling the doorway. "I'll talk to him." Marcus was sitting on his bed, staring at his homework but not really seeing it when his father knocked on the door. Commander Thompson had a presence that could command respect in any room, but with his son he was always gentle. "Can I come in?" David asked. Marcus nodded, and his father sat on the edge of the bed. For a few minutes they sat in comfortable silence. David had learned in his military career that sometimes the most important conversations started with just being present. "Mom told me what happened today," David said finally. "I want you to tell me about it in your own words." So Marcus told the story again, this time to his father. He watched David's face carefully, looking for signs of disappointment or anger directed at him. But all he saw was his father's complete attention and growing concern. "You did nothing wrong," David said when Marcus finished. "I want you to understand that clearly. Nothing you did caused this situation." "Then why did it happen?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. David took a deep breath. This was not a conversation he had hoped to have with his son at 12 years old. But circumstances had forced his hand. "Sometimes people make judgments about others based on how they look rather than who they are," David said carefully. "It's wrong and it's unfair, but it happens." "Because I'm black?" Marcus asked directly. The question hung in the air between them. David had always known this day would come, but he had imagined it happening differently, perhaps during a teachable moment while watching the news or reading a book together. Not because his son had been humiliated and frightened by the very people who were supposed to protect him. "Yes," David said simply. "I believe that's part of what happened today." Marcus felt something shift inside him. Having his father confirm what he had suspected made it real in a way that was both relieving and devastating. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked. Now we make sure this doesn't happen again, David said. And there was something in his voice that Marcus had never heard before. It was quiet, but it was also dangerous. That evening, David Thompson made several phone calls. The first was to his lawyer, an old friend from his early Navy days who now worked in civilian law. The second was to the principal of Marcus's school, who needed to be aware of what had happened to one of his students. The third was to a contact he had in the local police department, a captain he had met during a community outreach event. But it was the fourth call that would prove most significant. David called his commanding officer and requested permission to take a few days of personal leave. When asked why, he simply said it was a family matter that required his immediate attention. The next morning, Commander Thompson put on his dress uniform. He had worn this uniform to meet with foreign dignitaries, to receive commendations, and to attend formal military ceremonies. Today, he was wearing it to have a conversation with two local police officers who had made the mistake of underestimating his son. David spent an hour researching Officers Bradley, Chun, and Jim Walsh, their service records, their training history, their previous complaints and commendations. He approached this like he would approach any military operation. With thorough preparation and a clear, objective dot, he learned that Officer Chun had been with the department for 8 years and had received 2 previous complaints about excessive force, both dismissed after internal investigations. Officer Walsh was newer, having joined the force only 18 months ago after washing out of a police academy in another state. Armed with this information, David Thompson walked into the police station at exactly 0900 hours. He moved with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, his uniform crisp, his posture perfect. Every medal and ribbon on his chest told a story of service and sacrifice. The desk sergeant looked up as David approached, and his eyes immediately went to the insignia that marked David as a Navy SEAL commander. Whatever the sergeant had been expecting that Tuesday morning, it wasn't this. "I'm Commander David Thompson," David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I need to speak with Officers Chun and Walsh about an incident involving my son yesterday." The desk sergeant's demeanor changed immediately. He had served in the Marines himself and recognized both the rank and the bearing of the man standing before him. "Yes, sir. Let me see if they're available." Word spread quickly through the station that a Navy SEAL commander was there asking about his son. Officers who had been joking around suddenly found paperwork to occupy themselves with. The casual atmosphere of the morning shift evaporated, replaced by the kind of tension that comes when everyone realizes something serious is about to happen. Officer Chun felt his stomach drop when he was called to the front desk. He had a sinking feeling he knew exactly what this was about, and the sight of Commander Thompson in full dress uniform confirmed his worst fears. Officer Walsh joined them a moment later, his face pale when he saw David's uniform and the serious expression on his face. "Gentlemen," David said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I believe you had an encounter with my son Marcus yesterday afternoon." Officer Chun swallowed hard. "Sir, if this is about the questioning near the convenience store, we were just following up on reports of suspicious activity in the area." "Suspicious activity," David repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Can you describe to me what was suspicious about a 12-year-old boy buying water after basketball practice?" Neither officer had an answer for that question. "I've reviewed your service records," David continued, pulling out a folder he had prepared. "Officer Chun, you've had 2 previous complaints about excessive force. Officer Walsh, you failed to complete training at your previous academy due to what your file describes as judgment issues." Both men shifted uncomfortably. They had expected anger from a parent, but this level of preparation and professionalism was unnerving. "My son is a straight-A student who has never been in trouble with the law," David said. "He volunteers at the community center, plays on his school's basketball team, and dreams of becoming an engineer. Yesterday, you made him feel like a criminal for existing while black in his own neighborhood." The station had gone completely quiet. Other officers pretended to be busy, but everyone was listening to every word of the conversation. "Commander Thompson," Officer Chun began, "we were just doing our job," No, David interrupted. His voice still controlled but harder now. Doing your job would have been treating my son with the same respect you would show any other citizen. Doing your job would have been recognizing that a child with a receipt for his purchase and a school bag full of textbooks posed no threat to anyone. David stepped closer to both officers, and they instinctively backed up. Even though he wasn't raising his voice, the power of his presence was unmistakable. I've spent 20 years serving this country, David continued. I've risked my life in places you've never heard of to protect the freedoms that you swore an oath to uphold. And yesterday, 12-year-old Marcus Thompson walked down Elm Street with his backpack slung over his shoulder, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the sidewalk. He had just finished basketball practice at Lincoln Middle School and was heading to the corner store to buy a drink before catching the bus home. His sneakers squeaked against the pavement as he moved with the easy confidence of a kid who had never known real trouble. The small convenience store was busy with after-school customers. Marcus grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and stood in line behind two high school students. He checked his phone for the time and realized he had 15 minutes before his bus arrived. Perfect timing. As he paid for his water, Marcus noticed a police cruiser pulling into the parking lot. He didn't think much of it at first. Cops often stopped by the store during their patrol rounds. But something felt different about this visit. The two officers who stepped out of the car moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the area like they were looking for something specific. Officer Bradley Chun was having a bad day. 3 shoplifting reports in the past week, all involving kids around Marcus's age, had put pressure on the department to crack down on juvenile crime in the area. His partner, Officer Jim Walsh, was newer to the force and eager to prove himself. When they received a vague call about suspicious activity near the convenience store, both men were ready to take action. Marcus stepped out of the store, unscrewing the cap on his water bottle. The parking lot buzzed with normal activity, people coming and going, cars pulling in and out. He started walking toward the bus stop, completely unaware that he had caught the attention of the two officers. "Hey, kid," Officer Chun called out, his voice cutting through the afternoon noise. "Hold up there." Marcus turned around, confused. He looked behind him to see if the officer was talking to someone else, but there was no one there. His heart started beating a little faster, though he couldn't understand why. He had done nothing wrong. Me? Marcus pointed to himself, his voice cracking slightly. "Yeah, you." "Come over here," Officer Walsh commanded. His hand resting on his utility belt, Marcus walked slowly toward the police car, his mind racing. Had he accidentally done something wrong in the store? Was there some rule he didn't know about? His mother had always taught him to be respectful to police officers, so he complied without question. "What's your name, son?" Officer Chun asked, pulling out a small notepad. "Marcus Thompson, sir," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing around here, Marcus?" Officer Walsh stepped closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the young boy. "I just bought water from the store. I'm waiting for my bus to go home." Marcus held up the bottle as evidence. His hand trembling slightly, Officer Chun looked Marcus up and down, taking in his basketball practice clothes, his worn sneakers, and his nervous demeanor. Something about the kid seemed off to him, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. "We've had reports of kids stealing from this store," Chun said. "You mind if we check your backpack?" Marcus's eyes widened. "But I didn't steal anything. I paid for my water. I have the receipt." He fumbled in his pocket, producing the crumpled receipt from his purchase. Officer Walsh barely glanced at the receipt. "The bag, kid." "Open it up." With shaking hands, Marcus unzipped his backpack. Inside were his textbooks, a folder full of homework, his basketball shoes, and a half-eaten sandwich from lunch. Nothing suspicious, nothing stolen, but the officers weren't satisfied. Officer Chun stepped closer, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Where do you live, Marcus? What school do you go to? Why are you really in this neighborhood?" The questions came rapid fire, each one making Marcus more nervous and confused. This was his neighborhood. He had grown up here, gone to school here, played in these streets with his friends. But the way the officers were talking to him made him feel like a stranger, like he didn't belong. "I live on Cedar Street," Marcus said, his voice getting smaller with each word. "I go to Lincoln Middle School." "I was just at basketball practice. Cedar Street?" Officer Walsh raised an eyebrow. "That's a nice neighborhood. How does a kid like you afford to live there?" The question stung. Marcus didn't understand what the officer meant by "a kid like you," but the tone made it clear it wasn't meant as a compliment. His family lived modestly, but his father worked hard to provide for them. They had earned their place in that neighborhood through years of sacrifice and determination. "My dad works," Marcus said simply, not sure what else to say. Officer Chun snorted. "Doing what? Dealing drugs?" The accusation hit Marcus like a punch to the stomach. His father was the most honest, hard-working man he knew. The suggestion that he might be involved in anything illegal was so absurd it almost seemed like a joke. Except the officers weren't laughing. "No, sir." "My dad's in the military," Marcus replied, his voice stronger now, fueled by a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "Sure he is," Officer Walsh said dismissively. "And I suppose he's a general, right?" Marcus wanted to tell them exactly what his father did. Wanted to explain that Commander David Thompson was one of the most respected officers in the Navy SEALs, that he had served multiple tours overseas, that he had risked his life countless times for his country. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way the officers were looking at him, like they had already made up their minds about who he was and what he was worth. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Other students from Marcus's school stood at a distance, whispering and pointing. Some pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment and shame, even though he had done nothing wrong. "Empty your pockets," Officer Chun ordered. Marcus complied, pulling out his phone, his house keys, a few crumpled dollar bills, and some lint. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious, but the officers seemed determined to find something. They made him turn out every pocket, examined his shoes, and even looked inside his water bottle. When they found nothing, their frustration became more apparent. "You're lucky this time, kid," Officer Walsh said, though his tone suggested that luck had nothing to do with it. "But we'll be watching you. Kids like you always end up in trouble eventually." Marcus stood frozen as the officers walked back to their car. The crowd of onlookers slowly dispersed, but he could feel their stares burning into his back. His bus had come and gone while he was being questioned, which meant he would have to call his mother for a ride home. As he pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, Marcus felt something break inside him. For the first time in his young life, he understood that the world might not see him the way his parents did. That his good grades, his clean record, his respectful behavior might not matter to some people. That he could be guilty of something simply by existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The walk to a nearby bench felt like the longest journey of his life. Marcus sat down heavily, his backpack sliding off his shoulder onto the ground. He stared at his phone screen for several minutes before finally finding the courage to call his mother. "Hi, Mom," he said when she answered, his voice barely holding together. "Can you come pick me up? I missed my bus." Lieutenant Sarah Thompson could hear something wrong in her son's voice immediately. "What happened, Marcus? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Marcus lied, because admitting what had just happened felt too big, too complicated, too painful. "I'll explain when you get here." As he waited for his mother, Marcus replayed the encounter in his mind. He tried to understand what he could have done differently, what signals he might have missed, what he could do to prevent something like this from happening again. But every angle he examined led to the same uncomfortable conclusion. He had done nothing wrong. And it hadn't mattered. The afternoon sun was beginning to set when his mother's car pulled into the parking lot. Marcus gathered his things and walked toward her, each step feeling heavier than the last. He knew that once he got in that car and told his mother what had happened, there would be no going back. The innocence of his childhood, the belief that the world was fundamentally fair and just, would be gone forever, but he also knew that he couldn't keep this secret. Not from his parents, and especially not from his father. Commander David Thompson had taught his son to always tell the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. And this truth Marcus was beginning to realize was about to change everything.